Hello, hello. Welcome to another 10K Let's Play analysis. My name is Sage Seeds Cap, and my goal is to make everyone a financial sage by walking Domino's Pizza. Many of us might know about Domino's specifically, but I'm willing to bet pretty much all of us know about pizza and chicken and bites or whatever it is the other stuff is. Back in the day, I remember they used to fight to be considered a technology company rather than a restaurant company. Maybe that's something we can touch on in the financial statements or in the report. Maybe not though. Just an interesting fun fact. It was over a decade ago now, I guess, but I've been doing this long enough to remember when Domino's didn't want to be considered a restaurant. Maybe they're still not considered a restaurant. I don't know. But so nothing too fancy. Just go to the classic opening move: income statement, cash flow statement, balance sheet. Now this will be an over-explained walkthrough. What that means is I'm going to absolutely explain the three financial statements as well as anything else we have to look at in order to capture the story that is being told behind these numbers. Item 8 is the financial statements, the numbers of the report, and it usually starts, or it always starts off with a note about the accounting firm that audited their accounting. The auditor had one thing to say, which is this header right here: valuation of casualty insurance reserves. The auditor disagrees with the presentation of specifically casualty insurance, which amounts to just under 60 million. We can come back to this if it becomes interesting. Otherwise, let's look at the balance sheet. So we have 2 years annual figures, and what we need to remember about the balance sheet is that it is a snapshot. All of these rows are actually changing, certainly for Domino's day to day. What we want to do is we want to, on the 1st of January, on the 2nd of January, we want to take a snapshot and then compare what has happened over the course of a whole year. And so we remove ourselves from the day to day by zooming out, taking a longer term view. And then the questions are, this all represents company resources. Each row represents some of the company's resources. Where are the resources shifting over time? And are there any trends over time in how the resources are transforming? For example, over the last year, cash has gone down from 148 million to 60 million. With that being said, my eye is gravitating towards nothing really in particular. Sure, they have less cash, but that is not changing the picture in terms of their total assets. So they have very similar total assets, really. The same thing as they have very similar total liabilities. I mean, one thing we can pay attention to is their total debt, their long-term debt, so debt that they owe more than 1 year from now, is very significant, very, very significant. It's in the billions, whereas every other number is not even close, really, to the billions. This is multiple billions. So is that surprising that Domino's has a lot of debt? Honestly, a little bit. I didn't know. There's a joke there somewhere about how debt can be stacked together like dominoes, and we don't want to be in that situation where the dominoes begin to fall. Not that funny though. Looking at stockholders' equity, pretty significant retained deficit. That does surprise me a little bit. I have heard of Domino's to be one of the best stocks for investors year after year after year after year. Maybe others have heard this too. I'm not sure why the best, such a great stock for investors has 5 billion in debt and about 5 billion in stockholders deficit. I mean, this is quickly becoming close to, let's say, 9.5 billion or so of money that they've taken from shareholders and creditors and not returned. Let's try to understand more by shifting to the next statement. Now, this is the income statement, and this is always, always, always prepared from the company to the different governments that try to tax it. You'll see in every income statement is something like this row that says provision for income taxes. This is the whole reason this income statement exists. I'm a company. This is the money I receive. This is the money I pay out for different reasons, whether that be to suppliers or whether that be just for other activities that I need to do in order to get my inventory into clients' hands. That's general and administrative, marketing, things like that. Once the money that comes in and the money that comes out is accounted for, whatever is left, net income, is the most relevant for income tax purposes. And then often those are broken up into a per share basis just to help out investors in shares potentially. So looking at the last 3 years here, what we see is kind of declining U.S. company-owned stores revenue, offset by increasing supply chain revenue, stable pretty much everything else, and everything else refers to franchises in the U.S., international franchises. Not a lot dramatic happening. The company-owned stores business is declining basically, while the supply chain business is increasingly becoming larger. And we'll note is supply chain is already the significant lion's share of the revenue. I mean, this is over half of all revenue is coming from the supply chain business. One thing I'm noticing right away is that even though the U.S. company-owned stores revenue is declining, the U.S. company-owned stores cost of sales is not declining. And so, you could imagine a situation in which Domino's is willing to operate a couple of Domino's franchises itself. I guess not a franchise in that case. And then not make it a very profitable store just because having very cheap pizza stores out there is good for the overall brand. And what Domino's is really doing and why they, years ago didn't want to be considered a restaurant and all this other stuff is they don't think they operate restaurants. They think they manage a technology brand and that anyone who wants to start a restaurant knows that Domino's is the place to go to if they want a really high quality, high tech restaurant operation. Continuing with that, income from operations is just fairly stable, I guess you could say. It teeters a bit, but it's just fairly stable. And this interest expense, which is interesting because we saw that the debt was so high, it is increasing. It is not concerning necessarily in an immediate sense, but it's fairly large, like half, roughly half of everything they spend making everything for their U.S. company-owned stores. And so the entirety of their restaurants business is only twice as much as what they just pay in interest every year. Interesting to note. Let's continue to the consolidated statement of cash flows. This is the third statement in our opening move. What this is adjustments to the income statement, which remember was prepared in order to justify taxes, not for, let's say, quote unquote, matching up with what is actually in the company's bank accounts. This statement of cash flows is now in order to match up with what is actually in the bank accounts. And so if the CFO's office is trying to understand what money they have, they go to the statement of cash flows, not the income statement. The CFO's office is trying to coordinate with different tax authorities, then it will go to the income statement. Said differently, the net income directly from the income statement is right here at the top, and everything next underneath it is going to be an adjustment to the net income. Nothing too eye-catching in any of this. We could maybe, it's interesting to note that the equity-based compensation expense, also known as stock-based compensation, this is something that is by all means really good. Like it could be a very effective tool in running a business, especially if you want to motivate employees by granting them stock-based compensation. But it's also particularly tricky because there's not a lot of rules about, like every company is basically having to figure out for themselves if that is or is not appropriate. Oftentimes that is a bit of a weakness in terms of accounting, at least lately in the last decade or so. Not crazy large, but it is one of the larger numbers in all of this. So for example, they're paying more equity-based compensation every year than they typically are having changes in their inventory. Now, as a restaurant, maybe the explanation for that is that they don't need to keep a lot of long-term inventory. Like everything they make, they pretty much want to sell right away. I mean, it's a pizza, right? Want to sell in 30 minutes or less. it certainly is sizable when compared to the amount of income taxes that they're able to defer. And it represents roughly a third of all depreciation, which for a billions and billions dollar business, that's pretty substantial. Then again, they are a technology company. So if this were, and I guess I'm realizing I still don't fully think of Domino's as a tech company, because if this were like a tech company, I wouldn't bat an eyelash for that much of equity-based compensation. I mean, it's to motivate the innovators, I guess you could call them. Oftentimes, that comes with the territory is the people who are the most advanced technologically kind of expect to be paid in this way. So maybe that's all that's going on. The only really surprising thing is how much debt this company had, and that the equity, the stockholders' equity was at such a large deficit. That's the only two things that really stand out. Everything else is, maybe good, maybe bad, but it's stable, and that's really what the mindset should be when looking at an annual report. Um, is the company transforming in a measurable way? Can we see changes to the company? Really, for Domino's, I don't see much changes. I see somewhat of a surprise, so we might as well do our due diligence on the stockholders' equity deficit. But other than that, just keep rocking and rolling, Domino's. This is the statement of stockholders. Oh, they call it, usually it's equity, but this is deficit. Okay. This will explain or attempts to explain every dollar that the company received from shareholders. It tries to explain where that dollar has gone. This will hopefully be helpful in kind of saying what's the rationale besides maintaining such a large deficit. I'm not sure what would be a good use, like a good reason for having such a significant stockholders deficit, but that's why I want to look at this. Let's see what they're highlighting here, what they're pointing out. Ah, I see. I'm learning something here. Okay, so Domino's has a reputation of being a very good company for investors. They're being creative here. All the money that they consider a deficit largely amounts to, every time they make net income every year, they reduce the deficit, but then they increase it again by purchasing common stock year after year after year. In fact, quite significant purchases of common stock, and also paying dividends declared on common stock. As you can see, the number of dividends declared is increasing every year, which corresponds to the how much they're paying per share on the over here in the row value. But focusing just on the purchases of common stock, this is a bit of an extreme example, but in 2021, so 1 year prior to when this report came out, the entire business made $510 million, and yet they spent 1.2 billion and some change on purchasing common stock. How could they spend more than twice? I mean, that's literally more than twice as much that they made in the whole year on purchase of common stock. Well, that's slightly related to why their cash went down that we saw early on in the balance sheet. But it's also the same reason that they have so much debt. Zooming back, combining what we saw on the balance sheet, what we're seeing here, and a little bit of what we saw in the income statement, what seems to be the game plan, what this business really is get a lot of people excited to pay you franchise fees, royalties over and over and over again. Use those very steady franchise fees in order to say, give us as much loans as we can. And maybe they're not literally taking out as much loans as the banks will give them, but they're being quite aggressive in taking out loans from banks. That money that they borrow from the banks, they then give to invest, arbitraging the difference between the cost of capital that the bank has and the cost of capital that its investors have. Some people interpret risk as the certainty of future cash flows. This is a very, very low risk investment, which justifies some of the success that it's had. I mean, a business, you can make a lot of money. You can also eliminate risk, and both ways legitimately lead to value creation. I didn't even know this was like something that could be done at such a billion-dollar scale, right? They've very creatively, and I'm assuming very effectively, given their history, have been minimizing business risk. They are innovating, very, very much deserve to be considered an innovator because they have turned technology, turned a staple food like pizza, turned a brand like their Domino's brand into a very low risk business when you consider risk as the certainty of future cash flow, right? They can be trusted with such huge amounts of debt from banks because they have created a fortress of royalty fees, supply chain fees, um, the certainty with which there needs to be money paid to them from all sorts of people. Basically, every single franchise owner in the world that has a Domino's is contributing to making Domino's such a good entity to loan money to that they can take advantage of that. And their core business here really is borrow from a bank at, I don't know the exact numbers, right? But say borrow from the bank at 3%, return it to our investors at 7%. That 4% is coming from the timing of the cash flows as well as a little bit of profit from what they actually sell as pizza. Hey, if you're getting more comfortable uncovering the stories behind the numbers, please like and subscribe. I've gone into the notes of the item 8. Every company has to make the same reports, include them in the same item 8, but then the bulk of this section of the annual report is actually notes which are entirely unique to the company. The company has complete control over what they include or don't include in the notes and how they make the notes. Consolidated long-term debt is a note, and so there's a whole note just for consolidated long-term debt, managing the timing of cash flows. There does need to be a business happening in order to sustain this. At the end of the debt, however many years that debt was for, there needs to be another loan. That's the key point, and what I mean by timing is that you make money when you refinance. They're paying back little bits. Could they pay back more? They could. Could they pay back the near-term debt first and then the long-term debt? They could. And in fact, I highlight that because what most companies do, not all, but I will say more than half of companies of this size, what most of them would do would be pay off all their shorter-term debt first and then not worry about the longer-term debt until that becomes the next debt. What's happening here is, hopefully exemplified, is they're very strategically paying back just a little bit of everything. And this precision with which they're paying back only a specific exact amount, that's what the business of Domino's actually is. This would be the money that they pay out in order to keep the arbitrage going, right? And so this is managing their debt levels so that they can be sure that they can refinance in a acceptable way when the time comes for them to collect more money in this finance arbitrage business. Even taking it back to the auditor talking about casualty insurance, they do have a lot of insurance somewhere here. Where can I find it? Insurance reserves. Yes, they have a lot of insurance reserves. They're grouping casualty insurance in there, but the insurance reserves are related to essentially anything you can think about, right? Workers' compensation, general liability, owned and non-owned automobile liabilities. It continues to go on for other things, right? And eventually they're mentioning the casualty insurance in general, and health costs for employees, just lots and lots of insurance. They essentially want zero surprises in terms of money cash flows. Because again, that allows them to build a second business, which is their real focus on top of it, right? And so they're getting insured for anything you can think about, even remotely related to their restaurants and their franchises, just to make sure that there is minimal disruptions to the refinancing or the financing arbitrage business. Overall, I know less than ever what industry to put Domino's Pizza in. It's so much more. It's so much more complicated than ovens and running a restaurant, right? So much of what they're doing based on this report is not really related to a kitchen at all. It seems like they want to innovate, and it doesn't matter to them in what arena that is, because what they're doing here, in my opinion, is innovative. Just everything about this oozed professionalism from what I'm seeing. Ultimately, what they're doing here is benefiting off of um, including banks in on the supply chain relationships that they've been gaining because of the brand that they built up. Innovative, I guess we could reserve for things that would be maybe changing, continuing to change how people live their lives day to day. Maybe some people saw the Apple video in which I was surprised that Apple was being run like a bank. This is a specialized financial firm. This is a debt refinancing arbitrage firm. They use the word recapitalization. So, I kept saying refinancing because that's what I was thinking before. If they want to use the word recapitalization, we'll give that to them. Recapitalization arbitrage firm. Wow. Uh, with an apostrophe S and pizza in the name. I'd be interested to know if people agree, disagree. Did I just get distracted by what seemed interesting to me? I mean, the rest of the business was large. They have so many franchises. We could have looked into all of that. But what I couldn't believe I was seeing was that second business that I don't know when they just put together on top of everything that I already knew about them. Maybe in the future, they go back to tinkering with their core delivery and pizza business, and then in future annual reports we really get a deep dive of understanding about how they manage their franchisees. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit excited to look at a good franchise business. I like franchise businesses. I want to the opportunity also to highlight a creator on YouTube that I've been watching over the years. The creator that I want to share today is Investing with Tom. He's from New Zealand. He's knows his stuff. He's a nerd, I would say, when it comes to investing and specifically value investors, and nerd in the very, very best way. Tom is frankly adorable and very intelligent, particularly if you want to learn about good old fashioned traditional value investing. And if you want to really understand the mindset of why some people think they can beat the market, these people aren't doing it generally from a place of arrogance. And I think Tom exemplifies that perfectly. I don't see an arrogant fiber in his body, yet he beats the market. Well, thank you everyone for walking through another annual report with me. This over-explained ended up being quite surprising, like I said, but that's the fun of these annual reports. Is I genuinely, even with a company that I've seen for years, I don't know when Domino's did all this. I'm genuinely surprised. I'm sure it's not the last surprise we're going to go through together. Until then, though, everyone have a great day. Maybe order a pizza from whatever chain you like, and share your wisdom.